Meet me on the softer side. Meet me on the softer side. Softer side of your heart.
Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. You can find out about this and all of our other author events at www.skylightbooks.com, where you can also browse our inventory as well as order books online. You can also follow us on Twitter or even be our friend at facebook.com. If you'd like to talk to a real person, we can be reached at 323-660-1175. And don't forget, Skylight Books depends on listeners like you to help support us. So whether you're in our neighborhood or browsing online, buy a book or two to help ensure that we'll be around for a long, long time. Thanks and enjoy.
We are so excited to re-welcome Colin Dickey, who's returning here to Skylight Books. Colin is the author of Cranioklepty, Grave Robbing, and the Search for Genius, and his newest book right now, which is The Afterlives of Saints. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Lapham's Quarterly, Cabinet, TriQuarterly, and the Santa Monica Review. He is also co-editor with Nicole, Antebi, and Robby Herbst of Failure, Experiments in Aesthetic and Social Practices. Tonight he's here with his brand new book, Afterlives of Saints. In Afterlives of Saints, Colin presents us with a history of faith as told through some of the strangest stories of the saints who murder, saints who gouge their own eyes out and hold them out for inspection, saints who minister to the petty and the bizarre and the maligned. The Los Angeles Review today, which calls the book seductive, a welcome revision like Chaucer, had a great essay, if you saw it at all, which I think I just found my newest favorite saint on the entire planet, which is Marjorie Kemp, is that how you say her name? Who is the patron saint of those who cry in public. So excited about that. Booklist called the book an unusual and quite fascinating collection of tales. Please help me welcome Colin Dickey.
Thanks. Hey, thanks everybody who I browbeat to come out here and the three people that I don't actually know here. But, okay, does this work? Is that better? So, I think I'm going to read two sort of short things. The first one is on St. Lawrence, and then you have your choice since this is like a bookstore. I can either read one about libraries or about sexy books. Do we? Wow. All right, I'm going to go with Vanessa's suggestion. Okay, cool. So this is Lawrence. This is probably one of the earliest essays that I wrote for this, and the moment at which I sort of understood what I was doing with these things. So that's why it seemed appropriate. Back in Jesuit high school, every day in chemistry, our teacher would begin class with a reading of the day's saint. He had a small book of feast days that he kept in his breast pocket, one of those cheap staple-bound books you used to be able to buy in grocery store checkout lines, and would read in his stilted Texas accent of the martyrs and persecutions of the early church. To this day, I remember his voice quite clearly, but from a year of feast days, the only saint I remember is Lawrence. A deacon under Pope Sixtus II in the 3rd century, Lawrence was martyred during the Roman Emperor Valerian's persecutions in 258, and according to legend, was executed on a gridiron over an open flame. As he was being burned alive, so the story goes, he cried out to his tormentors, "This side is done, turn me over and have a bite." At this, the whole class burst into laughter, and I remember our teacher's grim face as he looked up at us, quietly apoplectic at our sacrilege, and said dryly, "You don't laugh at that. We're talking about a man dying here. That's not funny." But of course it is funny. It's not for nothing that Lawrence is recognized now as the patron saint of comedians. Lawrence is the trickster saint, the buffoon, the clown. After Pope Sixtus was executed, Valerian demanded that Lawrence turn over the treasury of the church. Lawrence instead gave away all of the church's property and then brought Valerian a group of blind, crippled, and homeless men, telling the Roman emperor that these were the true treasures of the church. Sure, this isn't laugh out loud funny, but still. My chemistry teacher snapped at us because he, like so many believers, conflated the sacred and the solemn. Patriarchal religions like Christianity tend to be like this. The French philosopher and atheist Georges Bataille points out that no one ever laughs in the Gospels. The good news may be joyous, but it's not funny. But in other religions, laughter is integral. The anthropologist Bird Gibbons writes, many native traditions held clowns and tricksters as essential to any contact with the sacred. People could not pray until they had laughed, because laughter opens and frees from rigid preconception. Humans had to have tricksters within the most sacred ceremonies for fear that they forget the sacred comes through upset, reversal, surprise. The trickster in most native traditions is essential to creation, to birth. Because of this, Lawrence seems to me a saint imported from another religion, closer to Coyote or Raven than to Stephen or Catherine. At the moment of his death is this sudden reversal. With one joke, he takes the power back from his torturers, and the moment breaks open. In our laughter, we understand a little more about life and death. Bataille also writes that uncontrolled laughter brings us to the edge of an abyss, a stage of rupture, of letting go of things. And if Bataille reminds us that behind laughter lies death, Lawrence reminds us that to go willingly to your own execution is to laugh at death, and to laugh at death is also to laugh. Like most martyrs, Lawrence has multiple patronages. He protects not just comedians, but also students, as well as Rome and Rotterdam, Canada, and Sri Lanka. Perhaps most bizarrely, perhaps even disturbing, he is the patron saint of barbecues. In Christian iconography, saints are usually depicted with the instruments of their torture, as with Catherine in her wheel or Sebastian impaled by arrows. And so Lawrence is often seen holding a grill, sometimes balanced on his shoulder, the instrument of his death used to distinguish images of him from the other martyrs. But over the centuries, this grill has gone from being Lawrence's mode of death to his primary hobby. There's Lawrence, the guy with the grill, always up for a backyard get-together, always there to bless your Super Bowl party. How does this happen? How do torture and recreation get so casually commingled? Turns out to be somewhat common among Christian martyrs, and Lawrence is not the only saint who suffered such bizarre distortions. Agatha's torture included having her breasts cut off, and she is commonly depicted as holding those breasts on a tray before her. But the laity didn't always recognize these tan lumps as breasts. They were misread often enough, both as bells and loaves of bread, that she has become the patron saint of bell forgers and bakers. And then there's Bartholomew, flayed alive, who holds, in addition to his own skin, the tool used to cut that skin off, a tool that sort of looks like a cheese cutter. So Florentine cheese merchants took Bartholomew as their patron. These corruptions happen from the bottom up, from the uneducated and working classes, adrift in a world of subsistence and hardship, searching for patrons to aid them. In search of solace, they find these bizarre images of disembodied torture and do their best to make sense of them. It's not that the image of Lawrence with a gridiron doesn't tell a story, but you have to already know that story in order to recognize it. Seeing a painting of an otherwise healthy-looking man holding a grill means nothing without some context. The image of the saint works like a parable. It doesn't tell a story so much as hide it. When asked about the parables by his disciples, Jesus tells them bluntly, "The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them," meaning the unbelievers. He goes on, whoever has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though looking, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not understand. Or, as Kafka put it, all these parables really set out to say merely that the incomprehensible is incomprehensible, and we know that already. The image of Lawrence and his gridiron is a parable in the sense that only the self-selecting few who already know his story recognize it in such an incomprehensible image. It is those who don't know the story of Lawrence who misread it as a barbecue rather than torture, doing their best to make sense of a visual parable. They look but do not see. It's perhaps because of this inherent ambiguity that images were always distrusted in the early church. Inheriting the legacy of the Hebraic tradition and its second commandment forbidding graven images, early Christians thought pictures inherently untrustworthy, lacking the rock-solid truth of words, and banned them accordingly. It wasn't until several hundred years after Lawrence's death, that this changed with Cyrenius the iconoclast. The Bishop of Marseilles, Cyrenius, had found his recently converted flock making images of Jesus, and he destroyed them. When Pope Gregory the Great got word of this, he sent a long letter praising Cyrenius' zeal, but telling him to leave the images alone, since Those who do not know letters may at least read by seeing on the walls what they are unable to read in books. With that stroke, a centuries-old ban on image making was ended, and the floodgates opened. For Gregory, images are books for the illiterate, but if so, they are a curious kind of book, one whose meaning is strangely open to interpretation, in which the poor and the illiterate have been free to adapt the ambiguous images adorning churches in whatever manner they might that will give them solace or hope. It is here, in these misinterpretations, that the odd patronages of the saint, that Catholicism reveals its folk aspect, its native traditions and local customs. It is here that St. Lawrence reigns, his trickster laugh stretching the world beyond the humorlessness of the gospel truth and fundamentalism. On the other side of orthodoxy lies this legacy of distortion and expansion, where we look and do not see, yet see something new, something else entirely. So... Do I have to do another one, or should I? Yeah, okay, cool. We'll do one more. Okay. Just let me know. Okay. Lost in the limitless labyrinth of books is Teresa. Born in March 1515 in Avia, she was born for reading and as a young girl read incessantly. I do not believe I was ever happy if I had not a new book, she writes in the opening of her autobiography. She learned this love from her mother, who was fond of chivalric romances and always made time for her children to read. Teresa's father disapproved, thought it a waste of time, a corrupting of his children's minds. Teresa and her siblings had to keep the reading a secret. She began to call it an addiction, her little fault. She read in the quiet of dark spaces, much like the young Marcel Proust, who centuries later described seeking out the dim coolness of his room to evade his family and read in secret. In the lives of the saints, she found an early love of martyrdom, and when she was 7, she and her brother ran away from home to be martyred at the hands of the Moors, only to be returned home by her uncle. Perhaps her father was right. Reading was dangerous, at least for someone like Teresa. Under the thrall of her emotions, a love of books went hand in hand with a love of death. At the same time, Teresa found no fault with her reading. It did not seem wicked to me, she wrote many years later in her autobiography, to waste many hours of the day and the night on this vain occupation, even though I had to keep it secret from my father. Even as an adult writing of those times, she saw in retrospect the vices of reading, how it began to chill my desires and lead me astray in other aspects as well. What to make of a book that begins with the perils of reading? Should we put it down, go no further? To keep reading, it seems, is to implicate ourselves. It is our little fault that drives us on, our vain occupation, our addiction. We may read, but to read Teresa's autobiography is already to be an interloper, to trespass into a world you've been warned against. She doesn't want us here, even as she beckons us in to come in. Teresa's is a strange book, a book with no place for a reader. Her mother died when Teresa was 12, and she fell even further under the sway of her romances. When she was 15, her father placed her in a convent. There she found her calling, despite being plagued in her early years by serious health problems. Under the direction of a Franciscan, Peter of Alcantara, she set out in 1560 to found a Carmelite convent in Avia. Her convent brought back the old order, reinstating flagellation and discalcation, the forbidding of the wearing of shoes, and from 1567 to 1576, Teresa set up convents of discalced Carmelites throughout Spain. Around the same time, she was asked by her confessor, Pedro Ibanez, to record the events of her conversion, a record that became her autobiography. In the century since, it has become the most widely read book in Spanish after Don Quixote, which first appeared only 35 years after Teresa wrote her autobiography. Like Cervantes' masterpiece, Teresa's autobiography is about the dangers of reading. Cervantes' Quixote is poisoned by the same chivalric romances that Teresa read as a child. He sells his estate to buy more and more books until they finally drive him mad, and he begins a quest not unlike that attempted by Teresa when she was 7. Teresa's story caught like wildfire. It may have been about the dangers of reading, written for a private audience, but that hasn't stopped the thousands who have flocked to it. After all, we want to eavesdrop. We want to read what is forbidden in the dim coolness of private rooms. We want to be affected by the wickedness of the book, to share in Teresa's little addiction, to succumb to Quixote's madness. Teresa's life is proof that she finally triumphed over this vice, reformed her ways, and followed Christ, but traces of her love of reading remain all over her autobiography. In a book that opens with a scene of reading, she recalls with bitterness how her confessor removed all the books in Spanish from the convent. I felt it deeply because some of them gave me recreation, and I could not go on reading them, since now I only had them in Latin. Later, she calls Christ himself a veritable book in which I have read the truth. Hers may be a story about God, but it is told as an allegory of the reader and the writer. Her writing is often chaotic. She asks permission before speaking. She loses herself on tangents before returning to a half-remembered topic, and at times she's repetitive. I seem to have wandered from my subject, she says more than a few times. At times she supplicates herself abjectly before her confessor. At other times she reprimands him for a dim understanding of Christ. Through all of this, she seems to acknowledge that the book will have no editor and that she will never look back on what she's written. And she's not bothered by this. Like that of a 19th century spirit medium, Teresa's is an automatic writing. We have long since lost the ability to see the art in this. In the 21st century, we are too used to the idea that the work of art must have a holistic and unified effect, that it must be perfect. Even contemporary writers who might emulate such chaos, Nabokov in Pale Fire, for example, do so deliberately with extreme calculation. The better corollary to Teresa would be writers like Gerard de Nerval and Antonin Artaud. Like Artaud's works, Teresa's autobiographies come alive in its madness, though madness is not the right word for many of these writers. Ecstatic is better. Writing that doesn't tell a story or impress an idea so much as it records the simple alchemy of putting pen to paper. Ultimately, Teresa's autobiography is a book about the act of writing itself. I see so much perdition in this world, she writes, that even if my writing has no other effect than to weary this hand that wields the pen, it brings me some comfort. Teresa's autobiography is a strange mixture in which she writes of the dangers of reading and the pleasures of writing. Like Gregory or Radigan, Teresa's work comes alive when it breaks against itself, when its sutures rupture and break, when something unintended shows through. This kind of writing is always vulnerable, and readers and commentators always want to reduce it to something it's not. The danger is in making her sane, in reading the work as a holistic piece of art. The error would be to read it as complete, a masterpiece. Doing so, as many have, is to read her ecstasy in the most banal of ways. Many outside of Spain know her through Bernini's famous sculpture, her head thrown back, her mouth agape, as a cherub hovers above her with an arrow. Bernini's sculpture depicts perhaps the most famous moment in Teresa's autobiography, a description of an ecstatic vision that comes later in the book. In his hands I saw a great golden spear, and at the iron tip there appeared to be a point of fire. This he plunged into my heart several times, so that it penetrated to my entrails. When he pulled it out, I felt that he took them with it and left me utterly consumed by the great love of God. The pain was so severe that it made me utter several moans. The sweetness caused by this intense pain is so extreme that one cannot possibly wish it to cease. Nor is one's soul then content with anything but God. This is not a physical pain, but a spiritual pain, though the body has some share in it, even a considerable share. Whatever was happening in Teresa's mind and in her body as this experience was taking place, most modern commentators have seen only one possible explanation. Marie Bonaparte, a practicing psychoanalyst and a friend of Freud, who was at the time measuring the distance between the clitoris and the vagina in 250 women, spoke for many readers when she declared unequivocally that Teresa's revelation was nothing more than a, quote, violent venereal orgasm. Bonaparte was something of a literalist, to be sure, but she makes plain the problem, the dangers in reading Teresa. To read her and see only sex, as we have been conditioned to do, is the same error as reading her and ignoring sexuality altogether. One understands why Teresa tells us how she earnestly begged the Lord, "Grant me no more favors if they must have outward and visible signs." To see a saint in rapture is to misunderstand, and to read her ecstasy is to misread. Perhaps there was some divine accession to her request when she died in October of 1582, just as Catholic countries were switching from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, a realignment that necessitated the loss of October 5 through 14. Thus she left the earth sometime between the night of October 4th and the morning of October 15th, in those strange invisible days of history. Bernini's genius is in the massive cloak that covers Teresa so that only her face and hands are visible. Everything else lies below the surface, lost in those endless folds. In there somewhere is the ecstasy of writing, the relationship of reader and writer. You may guess at its contours, but you will never know its shape. It is under the folds of such a cloak that the perfect book and the perfect library lie, hidden, shapeless, but somehow moving, somehow alive. Thanks. So, yeah. I might have said that I'm getting over a cold, so if I sounded weird throughout the entire thing, that's where that came from. But anyways, yeah, I don't know if people have any questions or not, or...
What drew you to writing about saints? You said that the first one that you read was sort of the one that sort of got you started on this journey. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the last time I was here, one of the questions somebody asked me was, what's your next book? And I said, I'm going to write a book on Sarah Winchester. And I was so excited about it. And it was really, really hard to do for a lot of reasons. And so while I was trying to write that book and not being able to and getting continually frustrated with that, I started writing these sort of weird essays that were just kind of something to make myself happy and something to entertain myself. And only by accident did I realize that I was writing a series. The first two were not just about saints, but they were about famous writers who masturbated to saints. Yukio Mishima and Saint Sebastian, and Flaubert and Saint Anthony, and then I ran out of famous writers masturbating to saints. And although if you guys know any more, and so the Lawrence one was the first not overtly masturbatory thing I wrote. That was also like, that was like, okay, so you can do more than just talk about self-pleasuring. and so that's kind of how it started, almost by, I mean, they were sort of things that I was writing for myself as much as anything, but then I started to see ways in which you could do this in a way that wasn't, a religious book or an anti-religious book, and you could sort of enter into this conversation in various other ways. So that's how that happened, I think. So, yes?
Who gets to decide if a saint is the patron saint of the barbecue, and is that ever contested? Does anyone ever say, actually, not the patron saint of the barbecue, the patron saint of...
No, because it's sort of like, I mean, the process to become a saint is really rigid. Like you have to be in some incurable disease, and you have to specifically pray to somebody who's not a saint, and then you have to get better to prove. Like if you are sick and you pray to John Paul II and to Saint Catherine, it's a wash, because then they'll just come and say, oh, that was St. Catherine who healed you, it wasn't John Paul II. And so to become a saint is a really, like, they're like legal documents, and they have like expert witnesses who provide literally the devil's advocate, the person who comes in and argues that somebody's not a saint. So Christopher Hitchens was the devil's advocate for Mother Teresa. He was like brought in by the church to be an asshole. And so what's that? She's not yet. She will be. Like, she's either beatified or blessed. I think you start blessed, then you're beatified, then you're sainted. Anyway, so that process is crazy. The patronage is totally laissez-faire. Like, if everybody in the village is like, I mean, that's the Florentine cheese people. Like, we all pray to St. Bartholomew because of the cheese, because he looks like he's been like cheese, then that's cool, like that. So the process for specific, and that's why you see saints with like 800 million patronages. Like usually a country will sort of all generally agree. Like you couldn't show up in England and say now, St. Bartholomew is the patron saint of England because that's St. George's deal. But for the most part, it's like if you can get enough people buying it, then it's usually okay. Yeah.
Two questions. How many saints are there? Do you have any idea? And then also, but also, what's the weirdest saint?
So the how you count the saints sort of differs on your criteria. And in 1969, as part of Vatican II, the church went through and kicked out a bunch of saints. They wanted only saints that they could verify actually had existed as historical figures. So like Saint Christopher, like the metal guy, not a saint. Yeah, I talk about Saint Barbara, who's my favorite like saint, who used to be a saint and now is not a saint. But then like Saint George is like totally tenuous, and yet he survived because he's like, the guy who killed a dragon was a real saint. So anyway, so according to the, but even so, I mean, so there are anywhere from like hundreds to like tens of thousands, and there's so many. There's like some like 8 saints will have the same name, and though there's all these saints that like nobody really knows anything about, and so whatever. So it's again like the church has a very like definitive number of saints that they like put in the church like calendar, and then every community's got like another 30, that they like that like rural France towns that have been worshiping this guy for like 1,300 years, and there's nothing like, the Vatican is going to say that's going to like take that away from them. So, the weirdest saint, I mean, there's a lot. I like Saint Foy a lot because she was really violent and mean, and killed people who disagreed with her, even though she was this little 12-year-old virgin martyr. She's really awesome. Saint Foy, F-O-Y. I like her a lot. I mean, I like Barbara, who's the saint of spontaneous combustion, and the person that like all like cannoneers, whatever, like the U.S. Artillery Association, the people who fire ballistic weapons, have a St. Barbara's Day ceremony every year because she's the patron saint of cannons and explosions. And so she's awesome. So I don't, they're like your children. You love each one of them in different ways. So, yeah.
So you said that you went to Jesuit school.
Yeah.
Are you a believer, and where that God is going to be pissed about your book?
I'm not a believer, so that answers the second question. I'm not a believer, but I mean the analogy that I make is that when I went to Milan and I went to the cathedral in Milan, which if any of you been, it's like the 3rd largest cathedral in the world, and it is huge and it is beautiful as all get out. I mean the feeling that I had was, my lack of belief in the deity that inspired this is tempered by my admiration and the belief of the people who did believe in it, and the people who built that. So I think there's a way in which you can still have this conversation that's not about, yes or no, belief or not belief, and again, this is why I try to make this book it's not meant to be like a religion sucks and you guys are stupid. It's more like, Saint Radegund, whether or not she was divinely inspired by some almighty figure, was still an amazing writer, and the work that she created is just like jaw-breakingly beautiful. Wait, that's a bad adjective. It's really great. She's a really good writer. So yeah.
How did you do the research for this? I guess why saints?
Kind of haphazard and all over the place. So I think that anthropology quote about tricksters is the epigraph to a George Carlin book. I think I could say that without. So some things like that, other things painstakingly researched in many libraries throughout the world. W.G. Sebald has this quote that I really like about how his research method was to go into a library as if it was closing in the next 10 minutes. And so he would run around sort of frantically grabbing things off the shelf in a really haphazard manner, but somehow always find what he was looking for. And I like to use that as a justification for really sloppy research methods. Like, I found what I needed sooner or later. So, yeah.
How did you create a shortlist? And is there a patron saint of saints?
I don't know if there's a patron saint of saints. I created the shortlist because after a while, I just had to stop because there were so many others. St. Columba, who is the first known sighting of the Loch Ness Monster, is not in here. St. Cosmas and Damian, who the patrons of surgeons who transplanted a black Ethiopian's leg onto a white deacon. The first successful transplant. So there's a lot of cool crap. There's the patron saint of border crossers, Saint John the Soldier, who was a child rapist and murderer who was sentenced to death by firing squad, but they let him run. So they shot him in the back as he was running away, and this is all in Tijuana. And then blood supposedly started welling up from his grave, and people became convinced erroneously that he was innocent when he was not, and so they started revering this murderer as a saint. And even though he's not, the church wants nothing to do with this guy, and they keep there's this big shrine at his grave, and the local bishop keeps clearing it out because it's really bad news. But he's now, when people are making illegal border crossings, he's who you pray on. I don't even remember what your question was. Oh yeah, so there's a lot in there that I just after a while I was like, this will take me my lifetime. So yeah.
What's interesting is how a lot of the saints are so marginal. So I was just curious about your thoughts on the relationship between the sainted and the sacred, the sort of old notion of the sacred as being the person outside of the law.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because a lot of the figures historically were not necessarily good. Were not
right.
And they certainly weren't approved.
Right.
So they operated outside the church, and then they become of the church and emblematic of the church.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the saints, and some of the ones that Radegund is a good example of someone who did horrible things to her body. Would heat up iron plates and then press them to her chest and stuff like that. And Catherine of Siena, I think, who starved herself to death, shoving branches down her throat, sort of anorexia, and how the saint is really the person who has a love of death in a really sort of profound way that is, especially the early saints, less so. The past couple hundred years, but the sort of post-persecution saints who couldn't be martyred by the Romans sort of lived for death in this really bizarre way, and so they lived at the extreme of what was acceptable in ways that the church has later really disavowed. I think that you're not, the church's policy is really to adore and revere these people, but not to emulate them in any way, shape, or form. And Mary Gordon, the novelist, has this great. She was talking about how when she was a child, how the nuns would tell her and her schoolmates when they were 7 or 8, you should hope that someday the communists put a gun to your head and say, deny God or we will shoot you, so that then you could go to heaven. And how she was horrified at this idea, but that she would put broken glass in her shoes to walk on broken glass, so that it was like a sort of, it's for her kind of a half-ass martyrdom. She would put them on her shoes, but then she would try not to step on them, and so so there's this really odd way in which they, the way in which the saints exist as this thing which is both magical and wonderful, but really sort of forbidden at the same time, and sort of not really allowed in sort of a contemporary culture which isn't obsessed with death in the way that these people were. At least that's kind of my take on it. I don't know. Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah. I mean, they're fast tracking John Paul II and Mother Teresa. They're trying to. Benedict is trying to get the Nazi Pope moved along, because Benedict's kind of a Nazi too. So that'll. Yeah, the guy who many historians fault as doing very little to prevent mass killings, that he maybe could have done a little bit more, but now he's saint. No, he's not yet, but he will be if Benedict sticks around long enough. So. Well, that's the thing that, and apparently this is this is something, apparently the best miracle is that you cure Parkinson's. This is a good way to go because Parkinson's is kind of an ambiguous disease in the first place. It's not like your arm gets chopped off and then you regrow an arm. Like, that's pretty severe. Like, people would know that. But like, maybe you have Parkinson's and then maybe it clears up, and maybe you were praying to John Paul II while it was happening, and so maybe, but again, it is a really long process, and they send out like litigators, and I've seen like the court transcripts, which are like thousands of pages of just like all the interviews, and like they try and make very sure that a genuine miracle happened, and then you get your ticket punched. So, yeah.
I'm curious why it takes so long. For something like Teresa, you'd think that they would. When they to be collected at this point?
Well, I think it used to not take long, obviously. If you're martyred, you're straight in. Like, you're good to go. And I don't know exactly when they changed the procedure, but I think the part of the problem was they were just making any old Joe a saint, and I think at some point they wanted to establish some legitimacy and prove that these were genuine miracles that were happening. This wasn't some sort of folk nonsense that just because a bunch of illiterate peasants somewhere claimed somebody was a saint, they tried to say, no, we're gonna make this real. We're gonna make it rigorous. But obviously with somebody like Mother Teresa, they are trying to speed it up. So yeah.
Do you know if the church, the curate, had like the initial say over what the image of the saint would be, before it sort of?
No, again, that's what's really awesome is how random that is. One of the things, like Saint Sebastian with the arrows, like he didn't die from getting shot full of arrows. Like that's not like he survived that, and it was only because there was like a couple sort of fresco cycles that casually omitted his actual moment of death in favor of the arrow thing, that everybody just assumes he was killed by arrows and stuff like that. And so it's totally arbitrary. It's totally some more so than others, but there's no, you want to paint Cosmos and Damien putting a black dude's leg on a white dude, like you go nuts, like that's whatever makes you happy. Yeah. Yeah, but they don't conflict so much as like everybody gets in. You can be both patron of cheese makers and patron of bakers, and it's cool. Like
there's like 5 different Apollos.
Yeah, it's cool. Like more the merrier. It's all good. Yeah, like whatever gets people to the church, I think is cool. So, yeah. Oh yeah.
I apologize. I think I'm getting a little bit triviality or something you said, but I just want to circle back.
Sure.
You said you read a lot of these court documents.
I saw them. I didn't actually. I wasn't going to read that shit. No, I'm kidding.
I guess the question I want to ask, when you're talking about these miracles,
Yeah.
up on is, do you have any experience with seeing, in essence, how the church has disproved a miracle? How would they reject the miracles? By what measure does that happen? It seems like my friends pray to me to their flu would get better, and then their flu got better, and I'm on my way.
Yeah, no, I don't. And again, I know a lot of that stuff anecdotally, but the process to sainthood, I probably didn't delve into as much as. And so, no, I'm sure that there are cases like that exist where they sent somebody out and they came back saying, I don't know, this is pretty suspect, and but I can't name you a case offhand. I just would assume that would have happened. Yeah, no, it's cool. So, did you?
Isn't there also a requirement that the body not?
Oh yeah, the body should not decompose. So there's a lot of digging up of corpses. Yeah, exactly. And if you would like to learn more about grave robbing, thanks, Emily. But I think they dug up Cardinal Mezzofante's body in the 1870s to see if it had corrupted. This is a Italian cardinal who knew something like 50 to 75 different languages. My friend Michael O'Rard wrote a book about him on hyperpolyglotts. But yeah, his head was stolen too. But yeah, so they dig up the bodies to see if they're incorruptible. But again, it's like, what's incorruptible to you and to me is just like good moisture control, like it's sort of like. But yeah, there's a saint in New York City, like in Manhattan, who's on display and is. Do you know who it is? Yeah, right. So you can totally see incorrupted bodies if you want. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. There's some are overlapping, or they have different days, and yeah.
What's your next book? Sarah Winchester?
Yeah. It might be the Sarah Winchester book, although once again, might be something else. So we'll see how that goes. Yeah, hopefully it'll be the Sarah Winchester book. So yeah.
It struck me that when you were talking about the Native American, the archetypes of the there are so many religions that work with gods instead of saints, and I thought that's got to be related to the fact that like Catholicism is the monotheistic religion, and they're still building this pantheon of things to worship in a sense.
Yeah.
So do you feel like there's something to that in like the reason that people need saints?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly one of the Protestant critiques of Catholicism is the fact that the saints sort of almost make it a polytheistic religion. For me, I mean, had these people been actual gods, I think I would have been less interested, because I think fundamentally what interests me about these people is that they were people. They were people who, for whatever reason, were sort of moved to act in a specific, really extreme way. And again, that's why like Jesus is like almost nowhere in this book, for better or for worse, just because as interesting and fascinating as a story that is, that's a story of a divine being that comes down to earth, rather than somebody who is sort of totally and fully mortal and leads this life, and so I think that what's really fascinating to me about the fact that these, as much as there is this kind of polytheistic, like in the almost like a sort of Hindu way of like you have your local god that you would pray to and like that kind of thing, but fundamentally they all started out as people, and so I think that's really for me it was a compelling lens to try and understand these stories. So yes, Robby.
I tried to ask this question the other night, and I'm going to try to make more sense. It seems to me that the reading that two that you hit, one that you read, one that you hinted at, and one that I did the other night, it seems to be that you're reflecting in a way on literature by exploring these saints.
Yeah. And
I'm wondering why you would use saints, the stories of the saints, to reflect on literature.
Partly because I generally thought with people like Teresa and like Gregory of Tours, like that there's almost a genre of like ecstatic writing, and the way that one writes about the divine that you could probably parse out as sort of substantively different than literature. But the flip side of that is the way in which literary figures write about saints in the same way. Like I'm also drawn to like paintings, there's a lot of Caravaggio and De La Tour and stuff like that. Like I'm really obsessed with how people choose to depict these figures, and I find that to be another sort of fascinating thing. So I think those two together are kind of what drove this as a meditation, not just on these figures, but the representations of. So should we?
Yeah. So if there's maybe one last question, and then no more questions. Okay. So
cool. Thanks everybody.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget that you can check out this and all of our other great podcasts at www.skylightbooks.com. Today's music was provided by Fragile Gang. You can check them out at MySpace, Facebook, and the iTunes Music Store. Thanks for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.